The Pentagon just quietly confirmed the 2 leaked videos from 2017 that showed these strange objects whipping around our atmosphere are totally authentic, and to this day, they have no idea what they are. Before I get into today's list, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right channel, because that's all we do, and we upload 3, 4, even 5 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please order 8 large pizzas to the Like Button's house and tell the store you'll pay cash at the front door. Also, please subscribe to this channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's stories. Late one night in the summer of 1977, a large radio telescope in Ohio intercepted a very unique signal. The telescope was searching the sky on behalf of an organization called SETI, which is the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, and the signal, although it only lasted 72 seconds, fit the profile of a message beamed to us from another world. Jerry Amon, who was a project scientist for SETI, was flipping through some of the computer printouts generated by the telescope when he noticed a series of letters. Now, the way this particular radio telescope worked is it pretty much constantly picked up a signal, but that signal was a very low background hum of static. And that was represented in 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. All those low numbers are representative of that basic background sound that they just write off. It doesn't matter. Occasionally, the telescope would pick up a higher number on the readout, like a 7, an 8, a 9, and even above that, it transitions to letters to represent louder radio signals. But all of those higher signals had a rational explanation. Either they were anomalous or they were tied to something very natural and ordinary. But that particular night in 1977, as the telescope swept across the sky, it picked up a signal that was so strong it surged past 0 through 9 and made its way into the letters all the way up to letter U, and it held it for 72 seconds, representing a signal that was 30 times stronger than what this telescope normally picks up as its baseline. And after those 72 seconds, the telescope eventually passed it, and that signal dropped all the way back down. So when Amon saw this amazing string of letters representing this radio signal, he circled it in red ink and wrote next to it, "Wow!" exclamation point. And from that point forward, this transmission became the WOW signal. One of the main reasons the WOW signal was not immediately cast out as some anomaly or chalked up to some other natural occurrence is because of what we understand about radio wave transmission. The goal of this radio telescope was to try to pick up radio signals coming in from other worlds. And so the way they did that is they opened up a whole bunch of different channels, receivers, they had 50 of them, and anytime they were aiming their dish in a direction of the sky, if there was any radio waves coming towards them, they tried to capture them on different radio frequencies. If you were aiming your antenna in a direction where natural radio waves were coming towards you, it would hit one channel and then diffuse over adjacent channels, because it's not a targeted radio wave. It's natural. It's more like a shotgun blast. Non-natural radio waves, like the ones we're familiar with when we listen to the radio, listen to music, those are targeted radio waves, meaning when they were sent out in a very narrow band. They were sent out on a single frequency, and only people that have turned to that particular frequency or that particular receiver are going to hear your message. That is a non-natural radio wave. The night that the WOW signal was picked up, it was only picked up on one channel. It did not diffuse over the others, meaning the WOW signal is not natural and was created by someone or something. And for the SETI researchers that are literally combing the sky for signs of extraterrestrial life, this is exactly what they were looking for. It is what an intelligent life form would do to try to communicate. They would use one radio frequency to demonstrate this is intentional. But despite decades of professional and amateur astronomers searching the sky for this WOW signal, it's never been found again. While there's many theories about what could have caused the WOW signal, obviously ranging from extraterrestrial life to a comet that passed by in 1977 that we only recently knew about, to a secret spy satellite, the bottom line is, to this day, we cannot adequately explain it. It remains the best evidence of alien communication ever obtained. There is a taboo that is held in the scientific and academic communities, as well as in government, news media, and all modern institutions. And that taboo is on taking UFOs seriously. As a result of this societal conditioning, many people simply don't believe in UFOs. And those same people will view others that do believe in UFOs or who are open-minded to it as the crazy people, when in reality, UFOs are blatantly real. I mean, blatantly so. And they've been whipping around Earth for some time. But because of that taboo, scientists and politicians, they don't want to do the research to figure out why they're here because it's career suicide. And what's worse is there's all sorts of programs, like I'm going to tell you about in a minute, that are designed to keep people conditioned to believe that everything is ponies and rainbows, and there's no aliens, there's no UFOs, there's no anything but Earth. In 1952, a CIA group called the Psychological Strategy Board concluded that the people in the United States are prone to mass hysteria when it comes to UFOs, and that we should be actively debunking any organization or person or group that is trying to get to the bottom of UFOs or other unexplained phenomena. It seems like the reasoning behind this was to protect the public from themselves. They did not want the public to discover something as momentous as the discovery of a UFO that is connected to extraterrestrials or some other unexplained phenomenon. They didn't want the public to discover that. They wanted the government to make that discovery so it could be controlled, the narrative could be controlled, and they could protect the public from falling into mass hysteria. Now, while we don't know if the government actually listened to this recommendation and began aggressively censoring any group or organization that was trying to get answers about UFOs, what we do know is that the government at the same time was investing real money to do their own research about UFOs. In December of 2017, the Pentagon had to come out and confirm the existence of a particular program called the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program after 2 of their videos had been leaked. This highly classified, highly controversial government-funded program investigated UFOs. The 2 leaked videos were filmed by American service members, pilots, when they saw these objects that were flying around Earth that were demonstrating what this program described as advanced physics, which is basically things humans haven't figured out how to do yet. The objects were able to accelerate with g-forces that were too much for the human body to withstand. They could reach hypersonic speeds with no sonic boom and no heat trail. They also seemed to resist Earth's gravitational pull despite not looking particularly aerodynamic enough to have lift or thrust. Metamaterials that came from these UFOs were made up of materials that you can't find naturally on Earth and would be extremely expensive to replicate. According to a Pentagon briefing this group gave in 2009 about all of their research into UFOs, they concluded that the United States would not be able to protect itself against some of the technology they had discovered. And these 2 videos that we're seeing are only the ones that were leaked. And in April of 2020, the Pentagon came out and officially confirmed those 2 leaked videos from 2017 were authentic, and to this day, the crafts or objects that were spotted in those videos are still listed as unidentified. They wouldn't say that unless they made sure it was not just another military craft or some other conventional explanation, meaning, really, we don't know what these things are. Here are the 2 video clips.
Nickel 6-1 Tango, Roger, over. Roger, there's troubleshooting machines out here.
Did you box moving target?
No, I took an auto track.
Oh, okay.
Oh my gosh, dude.
Wow, look at it fly.
Dude, this is wrong, bro.
There's a whole fleet of them. Look on the ASA.
My gosh.
They're all going against the wind. The wind's 120 knots from the west. Look at that thing, dude. That's not our LNS though, is it? It's not.
That is the LNS, dude.
Well, if there's like...
Look at that thing.
It's rotating.
Just 30 years ago, we had not discovered a single planet outside of our solar system. Today, we've discovered over 4,500 of them, and of all those planets we're discovering, 1 in 5 of them, scientists now say, are most likely habitable. There's really 2 criteria for a planet to be considered habitable. 1, it needs to be rocky, and 2, it needs to fall into the Goldilocks zone, where it's in its star's orbit in a place where it's neither too hot or too cold, allowing water to be in liquid form. One of the best chances we have so far at finding life on another one of these habitable planets is a planet called Ross 128b. It orbits an inactive red dwarf star, meaning it's likely not being bludgeoned by solar radiation, and we've detected strange signals emanating from the nearby host star, signals that perhaps have intelligent origins. Another habitable planet is Proxima b. It also happens to be the closest habitable planet to Earth, and is a lot like Ross 128b. However, the red dwarf it revolves around is much more temperamental and periodically casts out massive amounts of radiation that does make life quite difficult. It's also tidally locked and in synchronous rotation with its star, meaning one side of the planet is always facing the star and getting completely torched all the time. The other side, the dark side of the planet, never faces the star, and so everything is frozen. And so the only place liquid water could exist on Proxima b would be at the equator. Another area of the universe that scientists are focused on to try to see if there's life there right now, or could be life, is an area called the TRAPPIST-1 system. It's actually 7 different planets, all of which are considered habitable, that are orbiting around this one particular red dwarf. The really cool thing about this particular system is that the 7 planets are super close together. So close that if you were standing on one, you could look up and see all of the others, and you're so close you could actually make out geologic formations like mountains, and you could see clouds, and in theory you could actually travel between the different planets. So imagine going on vacation to another planet. But to really get you thinking, a new study just released its results this month in October 2020. They looked at all 4,500 plus planets that are outside the solar system, and they ranked them according to how likely they are to sustain life. Not whether they're currently sustaining life, but looking at their conditions of how good of a planet are they to sustain life. And out of the 4,500, there were 24 at the top of the list that not only can sustain life, but actually can sustain life better than Earth can. They are considered super habitable, and they are literally better places to live than Earth is, which is definitely a foreign concept for most people because they think of Earth as like this oasis in this vast universe where everything lined up perfectly to sustain human life. And already, just out of the 4,500 planets that were reviewed, that have only been discovered in the past 30 years, right? There's lots more planets out there. We've already found 24 that are better than Earth at sustaining life. So what happens when we discover there are millions, if not billions of planets out there? Just probability alone says there's going to be a heck of a lot more planets out there that are better at sustaining life than Earth, which really forces you to come to terms with the reality that almost certainly we are not alone. So that's going to do it, guys. I hope you enjoyed today's video. Let me know what you thought in the comments, and I will pin the best comment at the top of the comments section. If you enjoyed today's video and you haven't done this already, please order 8 large pizzas to the Like Button's house and tell the store that you'd like to pay cash at the door. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's JohnBallen416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is MrBallen. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit called Mr. Ballen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya. I read a lot of scary stories, but today's top story legitimately freaked me out. But before I get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right channel because that's all we do, and we upload 3, 4, even 5 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please invite the Like Button to come out to dinner with you to a very fancy restaurant, order a ton of food, wolf it down, and before the check arrives, say you need to go to the bathroom, but just leave the restaurant. Also, please subscribe to this channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's stories. In 1982, a very outdoorsy teenage girl and boy who had recently started dating decided to go camping in Maine. Around 1 a.m. on the first night they were there, the girl wakes up because she has to go to the bathroom, and she's about to unzip her tent when she stops because she hears some strange noises coming from outside their tent. It wasn't that loud, but it sounded distinctly like something was digging in the ground. But she really had to go, and she figured, you know what, it's probably just some small animal or something. And so she begins to unzip the tent, and there's a little bit of moonlight that night, and there was a clearing outside of their tent. So the moonlight's pouring through, so she has plenty of illumination. And so she looks through this tiny hole, and she can't believe what she sees. It is a grown woman squatting down about 2 or 3 feet away from their tent. Her back is to them, so she can't see that she's looking through the tent, and she's feverishly digging into the ground in front of her. The girl literally falls backwards into her tent. She's so startled by what she sees, and she lands on her boyfriend, who immediately gets up, and he's like, "What's going on?" And she goes, "Shh," and she points at the little hole where she had unzipped the tent, and she goes, "Look." The boy is confused, but he can tell his girlfriend is very serious, so he sits up quietly and he looks through the little opening in the door and he sees the digging woman. The boy recoils and looks at his girlfriend and he's like, "What is going on out there?" He takes a flashlight and she's telling him, "Don't do it." And he opens up the tent a little bit more and he aims his flashlight directly on this woman. And this gets her attention and she stops digging and she stands up slowly and she turns around and faces them, and she's got no expression. She's not giving them any indication why she's there. She's not acting aggressive. She's not acting scared. She's just completely neutral. And she stands there staring at them for quite a while before turning around and just walking away from their campsite. And after a little while, when they were pretty certain she was gone, they open their tent all the way, they go outside, they kind of scan around with their flashlights and she's nowhere to be found, and they go to where she was digging, and it's just this weird 4-inch deep hole in the ground. There's no rhyme or reason to why she was doing that. And so after sitting there wondering what they should do, they settled on, well, tomorrow we'll tell the park rangers that she was here and maybe they'll do something about it. And so feeling pretty confident that this woman's not going to come back, they both go back into the tent, they zip it shut, they get in their sleeping bags, and they're about to go to sleep when they hear someone running towards their campsite. And they know it's this woman. They immediately unzip the tent and they look out, and now the woman's not digging anymore. She's rummaging through some of their stuff that's outside of their tent. And the way she's doing it, they described as monkey-like. She'd pick something up, look at it, and throw it over her head. She'd pick the next thing up, throw it over her head, back and forth, just throwing things behind her. And so the boy gets out and he shines a light on her and goes, "You need to leave." And she doesn't react. She just keeps flipping through all their stuff until he gets pretty forceful and says, "You need to leave right now." And at that point, she kind of stops and looks at him like, "Huh, what are you doing here?" And then she gets up, turns around, and walks away. Now the couple really doesn't know what to do because she's clearly willing to come back after being confronted. But they stayed outside their tent for about 15 more minutes, shining their light and making lots of noise and treating her like she's an animal. And they're just trying to scare her away from the campsite. And after a little bit of time, they thought, okay, there's no way she comes back now because, we were pretty aggressive with her this time and she seemed to really get it. They both do go back in the tent, and as soon as they zip it shut, they hear her come running straight back to the site, like she was literally waiting in the wings for when they went back in the tent. And this time she runs back to the hole in the ground and she's just feverishly digging into the ground as fast as she can. And this time they come out of their tent and they're mad and they are screaming at this woman to get the F out of here. What are you doing? And this seems to kind of frighten the woman, who gets up and she looks at them like, "Why are you yelling at me?" And she runs away, and it looked almost animalistic the way she was running away, like she was feral. The boy and the girl are totally shaken up at this point. It's about 1:30 in the morning and this woman just keeps coming back to their site and they don't know what to do about it. So they turn on some lanterns and they turn on their flashlights and they decide, we're just going to stay outside until the morning. That way we know she doesn't come back and doesn't steal anything from us. But by about 3:30 in the morning, they've been outside for 2 hours. They're getting cold. They're super tired. The woman's nowhere to be found. And so they finally say, "You want to go back in and get some sleep? I think this time she's really gone." They get back in their sleeping bags and they go to sleep. They don't hear her again. The next morning when they get up and they unzip their tent, they look outside and all of their stuff has been thrown all over the campsite. And the hole in the ground that the woman had dug that was previously about 4 or 6 inches deep is now well over a foot deep. And they realize this woman must have been lurking in the shadows in the woods, watching them from 1:30 to 3:30 in the morning. That whole time they were out there kind of warding her off. She was just waiting, just watching them the whole time in the shadows, and as soon as they went into their tent, she must have given it a little bit of time, but then she ran right back over and she ransacked their site. But the strangest thing was, after they looked through all of the stuff she had chucked around, nothing was missing, and there was some pretty expensive stuff that was laying out that she could have taken but didn't. After they picked up their site, they went to the park ranger and they told them about what had happened, but the ranger has no idea what to make of it. He's never heard of such a thing. And so the couple just leaves that day because they're not about to spend another night here. And to this day, they have no idea why this woman was running onto their site and digging into the ground and rummaging through their stuff. It was like she was just a wild animal. In 2015, an experienced outdoorsman named Bob, along with his wife, his young daughter, and their 2 German shepherds, decided to go camping in a remote part of northern Oregon. When they arrived at the site, Bob began setting up the big family tent for everyone to sleep in, and his daughter said, "Hey, do you mind if I sleep in the spare 2-man tent that we always bring with us?" Bob and his wife deliberated for a minute, but said, "You know what, that's fine, but you gotta bring Guts." That's one of the German shepherds. Guts needs to sleep with you because he's gonna be your protection. So that night, after some s'mores around a campfire, Bob's daughter, along with Guts, retreat to their 2-man tent, and Bob, his wife, and Leah, the other dog, retreat to their tent. That night, Bob wakes up suddenly to what sounds like footsteps outside of his tent, and he looks to his side, and his wife is still in the tent with him, and so is Leah, the other dog, and he listens really closely, and he can hear his daughter is snoring, and he can hear the sound of Guts breathing. So his whole family is accounted for, but he still hears these footsteps, and they don't sound like light little scampering sounds like you might expect from a squirrel or some small critter. They sound heavy, like a big creature is roaming around their campsite. But Bob's dogs are really keyed in to protecting their family, and since Guts and Leah are not up going crazy about whatever's out there, he figures, you know what, it's gotta be an elk or something, and it's not gonna do anything to us, so Bob ultimately just goes back to sleep. The next morning, Bob gets up, and everybody's just fine. There's no sign of any intruders in their campsite, and so that only confirms to him that, yep, it was just some harmless animal kind of walking around the wilderness, because we're in a pretty remote area. That morning, they decide to go for a walk down the road that was right next to their campsite. And so they take the dogs, they start walking, and they make it a couple hundred feet down this road when all of a sudden Guts sees something or hears something and takes off sprinting down the road and turns down this little access road that branches off of the road they're on into the woods. And Bob is thinking, oh no, there's a campsite down there and this big German shepherd's gonna bound up on them and something bad's gonna happen. And so Bob, his heart's racing, he starts taking off after Guts. He goes down the access road and he finds Guts stopped right outside of a campsite. But there doesn't appear to be anybody in the campsite. But there's a tent, there's a cooler, there's a table, there's all the things you would expect at a campsite, just no people. So Bob runs up and he grabs Guts and he yells out reflexively, "Hey, I'm really sorry, he's totally harmless. I don't know what he saw. Hey, we're leaving." But then before he leaves, he realizes on the tent, there's this big scratch through it, like it's been cut open. And curiosity gets the better of him. And so he kind of walks up, keeping an eye out in case he's wrong and there are people still here. But as he gets closer, he realizes there's definitely no one here. This site is abandoned. Because he's looking around and all of their stuff has just been ransacked. There's scratch marks on everything, like animals have clearly come through here. And Bob, who is an avid outdoorsman, he knows how much some of their equipment cost. And he's thinking, why would anyone abandon this really expensive tent or this really expensive cooler? And as he's thinking about that, he turns and he sees there's a propane tank, a solid metal propane tank that has been completely flattened. But there's no tree that's fallen nearby. There's no source. There's no way that could have been flattened. So he's definitely unsettled by this, but ultimately he decides, you know what? I'm gonna take my family, go back to my campsite. I'll just call the park rangers. They can come down here and they can figure out what this is. Later that afternoon, Bob and his family are back at their campsite just a couple hundred feet away from this abandoned campsite. And at one point, his wife gets up to go use the bathroom. She walks about 70 feet away behind a tree and she squats down. And then all of a sudden, she gets up and starts running back towards camp. And Bob sees this. He turns and sees her running towards him. At the same time, Guts gets up and starts sprinting towards her. And so Bob's thinking, what the heck is going on? Bob turns to his daughter and says, "Stay right here with Leah." And Bob gets up and starts running towards his wife. And Guts, at this point, has run to his wife and past his wife. Guts has run way into the woods. And as Bob is running up to his wife, he's like, "What's going on? Why are you running? What's going on?" And she says, "I don't know. I just had this horrible feeling someone was watching me. And when I turned, I already saw Guts running towards me and it scared me. And so that's why I'm here." And he's like, "Look, go with our daughter and with Leah. I'm going to see what's going on." And so his wife leaves and Bob draws his pistol and he starts walking out towards where Guts has now stopped. Hair raised, growling, it's yapping and barking at something in front of it. And Bob's looking and he can't see anything. And finally, after not being able to figure out what the heck is going on, he just takes Guts and goes back to his campsite. When Bob got back to his campsite, he wanted to leave. And his wife wanted to leave. His daughter didn't really know what was going on, but the attitude was, we want to leave. However, it was getting late and they had a bunch of stuff they would need to pack up, and it was going to be a real ordeal trying to do that, especially without any light. So they decide, okay, we'll stay one more day and we're going to leave first thing in the morning. In Bob's head, he's thinking, okay, I heard weird footsteps outside. We have this abandoned campsite nearby that's been thrashed up in the flattened propane tank. And now my wife is running away from something and Guts is seeing strange things in the woods. Like there's a lot of weird stuff going on. And he decides he's going to set up a tripwire all the way around his campsite using a rope tied at about 8 inches off the ground, where along the rope would be little pieces of metal that would clang together. So if anything touched the rope, it would make the metallic clinking sound, then it would alert Bob that someone's here. And so Bob goes over to the edge of the site where there's an obvious starting point for this tripwire, and he bends down to tie the rope, and he realizes, oh my God, someone's already done this. There is another tripwire that's already been built around the outside of our campsite. It's just been cut, it's been broken. Like it doesn't work, but it's here. Someone else who was at this campsite felt concerned enough about whatever was in the woods that they already had this idea. Bob didn't even tie his perimeter. He just drew his gun, told his family, get in the truck, and he stayed up all night protecting his family in the truck. As soon as the sun came up, they packed up and they got the heck out of there. Bob is convinced that there is something out there in the woods in northern Oregon that was walking around their campsite at night, that's scaring their dogs, that's stalking them basically and watching them from a distance. And probably whatever is out in the woods is the same thing that caused the previous group to set up their own tripwire. And it's also probably the reason the other campers at the other campsite were willing to abandon their nice equipment to get the heck out of there, because they are not messing with whatever the heck is out in those woods. In 2004, wildland firefighters were called into a forest in central Idaho to combat an emerging fire. By the time the crew arrived at this forest, it was clear this fire was spreading a lot faster than they anticipated. As a result, Mike, who was the assistant superintendent, basically the second in command of this particular crew, he said he was going to hop on the ATV and drive off way ahead of them to see if they needed to spread out farther to stop this fire. So Mike hops on an ATV and he takes off down this ancient looking logging road that probably hasn't seen a vehicle or a person in decades. Mike had made it about a half mile down this trail when he noticed out of the corner of his eye a bobcat was running perpendicular to him straight out of the forest as if it was going to cross the road about 100 feet in front of him. Mike comes to a stop and thinks, this bobcat doesn't know I'm here. It probably is not used to seeing people. It's going to come out into this trail, see me, get spooked and run away. But instead, this bobcat runs directly into the middle of the road, turns and faces Mike in a very aggressive posture. Mike is shocked at what he's seeing because he knows bobcats are notoriously elusive and they're nocturnal. So for this thing to be out in the daytime and to be intentionally blocking his path and standing there aggressively like it's going to attack him was so out of the ordinary. So the two of them are just looking at each other, not moving for about 10 seconds until this bobcat opens its mouth and then begins screaming like a person. It did not seem like the right sound for what he was looking at. He said more than scary, it was just intensely weird. And just as quickly as this bobcat has arrived, it stops screaming, turns and runs to a tree, sprints up the tree and climbs onto this branch that happens to be perched right over the trail he's on. And Mike's looking up at this bobcat that's right over this trail, and he knows if I'm going to continue going down this trail, I have to go under this screaming bobcat. Although totally freaked out, He knew he needed to keep going down this trail, and he's thinking to himself, you know what, this bobcat is probably just scared of me, and that was its reaction, as bizarre as it was. And so he throws his ATV in gear and he starts slowly moving down the trail, the whole time keeping his eye on the bobcat, making sure it doesn't show any sign like it's going to leap off onto him. And as he got closer and closer, he just gunned it and sped underneath the branch, and luckily it didn't jump down on him. And as he got a little bit farther away, he turned up to look, and the bobcat had turned around and was still watching him very intently sitting on this branch. Mike makes it about another half mile down the road before he sees something else that's very strange. He sees a cabin. It's this little tiny cabin that's tucked away in the woods, and he's thinking to himself, I'm on federal land. There aren't supposed to be any private structures here. And he figures, even if this is illegal, I do need to stop and make sure no one's in there because there's this huge fire coming this way. And so he parks his ATV and he starts walking off the trail towards this cabin. And as he gets closer, he can tell it's not only a very old cabin, but it's almost certainly abandoned because he can see all these slats that have been put over all of the windows, like it's been boarded up. But when he got up close, he noticed something strange. The door itself into this cabin was not boarded up, and the doorknob was missing, and in its place was this shiny silver chain link that was thread through the opening where there should have been a doorknob around a wooden post that was right outside the door. Basically a makeshift lock because there was no doorknob to it. And he's thinking how weird it is that in the middle of this forest, on an old ancient logging road that clearly no one goes down, where bobcats are running around freely, that there would be this new chain here, which indicates someone must have been here recently. And so he bends down to look through the space that was still there from where the doorknob should have been, and he looks inside and he can't really see anything. And so he takes his flashlight and he shines it in, and he can't believe what he's looking at. There's all this furniture inside this tiny little cabin in the middle of nowhere, and it's all upside down. And he's just totally creeped out. So he puts his flashlight away and kind of backs up, and he starts walking back towards the road, and he can't help it, but the whole time he's looking over his shoulder back at the cabin, like someone's gonna emerge from outside of this cabin. He gets to the road, and by the time he's there, he's running. He jumps on his ATV, he whips it around, and he starts blazing back up the logging road back towards his crew. And when he turns the corner to where that bobcat was, he sees there is now a Native American woman standing in the middle of the path. She's wearing this tattered white nightgown, she's barefoot, and she's standing in the same spot he saw that bobcat. And she's looking at him as if she's expecting him, like she's been tipped off that he's gonna be here. And he stops about 100 feet away from her, and now he's officially freaked out. He's still looking over his shoulder towards that cabin because now everything is just totally weird to him. And before he has a chance to do anything, this woman lets out a scream, a blood-curdling scream that is identical to the bobcat's scream. And so Mike is totally unnerved by this. Everything about this day has really gone sideways as this woman is screaming at the top of her lungs, and then suddenly she stops. Mike's still just standing there like, what's going on? And she runs to the same tree the bobcat had climbed earlier, and she climbs up this tree and gets onto the branch where the bobcat was and perches like an animal on the branch looking at Mike. And now, just like the bobcat, Mike is going to have to drive right underneath this woman who is perched over the trail. And so he throws his ATV in gear and he starts driving, and he's staring at this woman, and now her mouth is just open like she's about to scream again. And as soon as he got close, he gunned it and went right underneath her. And he turned around after he got some distance away from her, and she's still on the branch, now turned around facing him as he drives away. He goes back, he tells the crew what he saw, and as much as they all want to go back and see this woman and see this cabin, they know they can't. They got to fight this fire. And so ultimately they do that, and then they leave. A couple of days later, Mike was in a bar in the town right near the forest they had just been in fighting that fire, and Mike had seen the woman in the cabin, and he struck up a conversation with a local. And he said, hey, do you know of any buildings that are in that section of the forest? And the guy kind of laughed, and he was like, you know, the only building I ever heard of out there was apparently some cabin where some crazy lady thought of herself as a witch, and she apparently had a bobcat for a pet. And so we as kids were just told to stay away from there. So besides that, I don't know. So that's going to do it, guys. Let me know in the comments what you thought of today's stories, and I will pin the best comment at the top of the comments section. If you enjoyed today's story and you haven't done this already, please invite the like button to come out to dinner with you at a very expensive restaurant, eat a ton of food, but before the bill gets there, say you're going to the bathroom and just leave the restaurant. Also, please subscribe to this channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's just JohnBallen416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is MrBallen. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya. There is this horrifying creature that lives on a tiny uninhabited island in the southwestern Pacific that lives underground, and at night it will come out and it will eat anything from coconuts to fish to birds to pigs to people. And in today's top story, we're going to learn about someone that accidentally wound up on this island totally stranded and came face to face with this nightmarish creature. But before I get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right channel, because that's all we do, and we upload 3, 4, even 5 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, on the next cold day, sneak behind the like button and slap their ears and then run away. Also, please subscribe to this channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's stories. Dr. Guy Garman, also known as Doc Deep, was an avid scuba diver, and in 2015 he decided he was going to put his scuba diving to the test and try to break the world record for the deepest recreational scuba dive. At the time, the current record was 1,090 feet, set by a man named Ahmed Gaber in 2014. Guy's plan was to go down to 1,090 feet and then keep going to 1,200 feet, and that would be his record-setting mark. But in order to do that, you need a dive site that goes down to 1,200 feet. But luckily, Guy did most of his scuba diving off the coast of St. Croix in the Caribbean, and that area was known for an incredibly deep dive spot. Now, when most people think of scuba diving in the Caribbean, they think of beautiful clear water and amazing coral reef and exotic fishes, and everyone's so happy and it's so great and the water's so warm. And off St. Croix, that was true. But if you continued going offshore about 250 feet, you'd reach a drop-off that's known as the wall. And we're not talking about a gradual drop-off. We're talking about the seafloor going from flat to turning 45 degrees and going straight down 2 miles into a complete black abyss. Now, the only people that are actually allowed to dive into the wall are very experienced scuba divers with all the certifications. But if you're a tourist and you come to St. Croix, you can still scuba dive off the coast, where it is beautiful and shallow and warm and there's reefs and fish, but you're allowed to swim out to the edge of the wall. And people report getting out there and standing on the edge of this cliff, looking in the water with their mask and not being prepared for how intimidating it is. I mean, you're standing on one side where behind you is like this tropical paradise, and in front of you is this seemingly endless void where we don't even know what's down there. I mean, we've only explored 10% of the ocean. These deep portions of the ocean we can't get down, so we don't know what's down there. What we do know is that sometimes whales will dive down into these deeper sections of the water, and scientists will be tracking their dive, and when they come up again, after only going down maybe 1,000 or 2,000 feet, they'll return with these massive bites taken out of them, because apparently there are creatures down there that we haven't discovered yet that are so big and so aggressive that a whale seems like a reasonable thing to go after for food. And so imagine standing on the edge of this cliff looking out and being like, what's down there? Well, our boy Guy decides, I'm gonna find out what's down there, and I'm gonna do my record-setting dive at the wall. And so after meticulous planning and hiring a support team that's gonna be there to help him do this dive, he, his wife, and his son fly to St. Croix and they get ready to do this dive. Guy had arranged for a line to be lowered right at the edge of the wall that was weighted down by an anchor that was gonna go down all the way to 1,300 feet. And they would put a metal placard at the 1,200 foot mark on the actual line so that when Guy went down, he would reach that placard at 1,200 feet. That's the record-setting mark. He would use a grease pen to mark the placard to indicate, I made it, this is legitimate, and then he would go back up, and that's how the dive was going to go. And so in the early morning of August 15th, 2015, Guy, along with his big support team, they head out to the edge of the wall. Guy gets into the water along with his son, who's going to go down with him for the first 200 feet, and he looks up at the support boat and he gives him the okay. He's ready to start the dive, and then he and his son give the signal. They're ready to go down, and they start their descent into the void. As they're sinking lower and lower and lower in the water column, it's getting darker and darker until it's completely and totally pitch black. They reach the 200-foot mark. They come to a stop as was planned, and Guy's son Kip would give his father a squeeze for good luck because they can't communicate, and then Kip would go back up, and Guy on his own continues down to the 1,200-foot mark. Once Guy was on his own, a timer started because it's very important to track how long he's down at depth, and his team was expecting him to be back up at the 350-foot mark in 38 minutes from when his son left. But 38 minutes came and went, and he was not at the 350-foot mark. But even though this is a big problem, Guy had a whole bunch of extra air canisters with him, and so if he ran into any sort of problem, he would be able to continue to breathe air and fix the problem before coming up. It would just mean longer decompression stops along the way up. And since he was tethered to the guideline, they knew he couldn't drift away. And so they just had to wait and hope that he ran into some problem and that he would fix it eventually and then he would come back up again. But he never did. They couldn't really send a rescue mission down to get him because Guy was going so deep. He was the only one that was able to get down there. No one else was qualified or would be able to do it or had the right equipment for it. He was totally on his own down there. It would take 3 days before they were able to get the right equipment that was able to pull this lineup out of the water, and attached at the end of it was Guy, and he was deceased. He had drowned. But the really scary thing about what happened to Guy is when he went down into that abyss, he had all these extra air canisters attached to him. And so presumably he went down the line, probably all the way down to the record-breaking mark, and then he got trapped somehow. And as he's trapped on this line in total darkness, surrounded by who knows what down there, probably for several hours, he just cycled through his backup air canisters wondering, am I gonna run out of air and drown? Or am I gonna get attacked by some animal down here? There is this tiny little stream that winds its way through a forest in Yorkshire, England called the Bolton Strid. It's not very wide, you could jump over it. It doesn't appear to be very deep, it looks like maybe a foot or two, and it's not moving very fast, but that's all an illusion. There are signs up all over the place that say do not go near the Bolton Strid, it kills people. Because just beneath the surface of this seemingly tame water body is a natural booby trap that has a 100% mortality rate, meaning every single person that has ever stepped foot in the Bolton Strid has died. In 1998, Barry and Lynn Collett were walking along the Bolton Strid on their second day of their honeymoon, and all of a sudden a torrential downpour starts just raining down on them, and the rocks they were on suddenly got pretty slick, and Lynn slips and falls into the Strid. Barry, being a good husband, runs over to try to save her, and he too falls into the Strid. A man named Desmond Thomas was on the other side of the Strid, and he saw Barry as he was running for his wife, and he saw him fall in, and he watched Barry's face as he was looking at him as if he was going to stay afloat at the top. Desmond said it looked like someone came up and grabbed his leg and yanked him under the water, and he didn't see him again. Lynn's body was found 6 days later in West Yorkshire, and Barry's body was found over a month later, 10 miles downstream. In another case, in 2010, an 8-year-old boy named Aaron Page was playing by the Bolton Strid for his birthday. There's an area that's totally safe, that's away from the Strid, where people have picnics and that kind of thing. And he came down to the edge of the Strid and was running on the rocks, and he slipped and he fell in. Now, an adult saw this happen and they ran over and they were able to grab onto him while he's in the water. But the pull from inside the water was so strong that this person couldn't hold on to this child, who was eventually sucked under and dragged away and drowned. And beyond these two reports, there's dozens of others of people trying to jump over the Strid and falling in and drowning. So why is the Bolton Strid so deadly? If you look at this picture, this is of the River Wharfe, and it's just a little ways upstream of the Bolton Strid. And all this water in the River Wharfe gets funneled into the Bolton Strid. And the way it fits through that narrow section that is the Bolton Strid is the river turns on its side. So when you're looking at the Bolton Strid and you think, oh, that's not that deep. Well, it is that deep. It's at least as deep as the river wharf is wide. And if you look at it on the surface and you say, oh, well, the Bolton Strid's not moving very fast. Well, that's because underneath the surface, there is a whipping current. And in fact, the current that runs through the Strid is so strong that if you were standing on one of the rocks overlooking the water, you're looking down into the Bolton Strid. Well, you're not really standing on solid rock. You're kind of standing on a ledge. You just don't know it because the water meets the edge of the ledge. Underneath the rock you're standing on, the water has completely carved it out. So if you were to fall in, before you get sucked under the water, you would get sucked against the side and you would disappear under one of those shelves and go way far back underneath these rocks. And then you'd get sucked under and drown. And a lot of people who fall into the Strid, they don't make it out the other side. They don't get downstream. They get pulled into all these different caverns and tunnels that have been carved out by that current, and they're trapped in there forever because no one's going in to retrieve them, not even with scuba gear. Because if you get in there with scuba gear, the current will push you into these different caves and you aren't getting out again. On June 1st, 1937, Amelia Earhart took off from Oakland, California on an eastbound flight around the world. It was her second attempt to become the first pilot ever to circumnavigate the globe. She, along with her flight navigator Fred Noonan, flew to Miami and then down to South America, across the Atlantic to Africa, and then east to India and Southeast Asia. The pair reached Lae, New Guinea on June 29th. A couple days later, on July 2nd, Earhart and Noonan would depart Lae, and they would make their way to tiny Howland Island, which was their next refueling stop, but they would never arrive. What Earhart was trying to accomplish at the time was such a big deal, and so when they disappeared, it was heartbreaking, and it made international headlines, and this huge search is launched for them, but they can't find them, and after 2 weeks, they officially declared they were lost at sea and most likely dead. 3 years later, and 350 miles away from Howland Island, which was the island Earhart and Noonan were trying to get to before they vanished, a British scientist was on this tiny little uninhabited island called Niku Maroro, and they made a startling discovery. He found an incomplete skeleton next to what looked like the remains of a campfire, and their skeleton was kind of torn all over the place, like they had been ripped limb from limb. Because of Niku Maroro's proximity to Howland Island, everybody speculated that this has got to be the body of either Amelia Earhart or Noonan. The bones were sent to 2 doctors in Fiji, and they unfortunately said, no, this isn't Earhart or Noonan, this is somebody else. So those bones were ultimately disposed of because no one could claim them or knew who they were, and everybody just kind of forgot about it until 2017, when a forensic anthropologist decided to manually re-examine the measurements of the bones that were taken off of Niku Maroro Island and compare them to real measurements of Amelia Earhart. And they discovered that clearly those doctors in Fiji had made a mistake because the measurements of these bones match Amelia Earhart almost exactly. So researchers go back to Niku Maroro Island and they go to the area where these bones were found near that campfire, and they look around and they find a couple 1930s era bottles, glass bottles, and one of them is a freckle cream, and Amelia Earhart had lots of freckles and she liked to use freckle cream to cover them up. She was kind of famous for doing that. And so they found that freckle cream on this island near bones that look like they belong to Amelia Earhart. So while some scientists are putting their energy into confirming that yes, those bones were Amelia Earhart. We don't have the bones, but we can show you with the measurements and the freckle cream. And there's another picture that apparently shows the landing gear of her plane off of Niku Maroro Island. So there's some people that are working on that angle. And there's another group of scientists and researchers that are saying, okay, let's assume that that really was Amelia Earhart. Let's figure out what happened to her once she got to Niku Maroro Island. And the leading theory is horrifying. Although Niku Maroro Island is uninhabited by people, it is inhabited by one of the scariest creatures on the planet, the coconut crab. They're 3 feet long, they can carry at least 6 times their body weight, and they use their pincers that are as strong as a lion's jaw to rip open coconuts, which is their main source of food. But coconuts are not the only thing they eat. They'll also eat pigs, they'll eat each other, they'll even eat themselves. And they're prolific climbers because they need to get up to get to the coconuts. But in some parts of the world, they use their climbing ability to climb up and grab birds and break their wings with their pincers and then drag them into their underground burrows where they will eat them too. The few researchers and scientists that have gone out to Niku Island have said at night, thousands of these crabs will emerge from their underground burrows and they'll go looking for food. And they have a really keen sense of smell and they can smell blood. So when one of the crabs goes up and grabs a bird and starts ripping it apart, the thousands of others will come charging over and swarm the bird because they've smelled the blood, and they'll rip it to pieces and they'll all try to get in on the action. And so the theory goes, Earhart and Noonan are making their way to Howland Island. They get off track somehow and they wind up crash landing 350 miles away on Niku Island on one of the reefs. Noonan probably dies on impact, and Earhart, who's badly wounded and probably bleeding, she gets onto the island and she makes her way up to that area where that campfire was found. And for some amount of time, Earhart is able to survive off of whatever she had on her in those glass bottles, but in her weakened state and bleeding, at some point she probably attracted the coconut crabs who one night came out and swarmed her, ripped her to pieces, and ate her. Today, Niku Island is only inhabited by the coconut crabs and it's protected land under the Republic of Kiribati. And so if you want to go, you have to get express permission from the Republic of Kiribati, and they send someone to go with you. And there's no airport on the island, so you have to land on a separate island and then ride to Niku on a boat. But you have to pass through Cyclone Alley, which means you can only travel there at certain parts of the year, and even then it's incredibly dangerous. So that's gonna do it, guys. I hope you enjoyed today's stories. Let me know in the comments what you thought of them, and I will pin the best comment at the top of the comments section. If you enjoyed today's video and you haven't done this already, on the next cold day, sneak behind the like button and slap their ears before running away. Also, please subscribe to this channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's just JohnBallen416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is MrBallen. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called Mr. Ballen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya. If you suffer from claustrophobia, this is probably not a good video for you. But before I get into those stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right channel, because that's all we do, and we upload 3, 4, even 5 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please sneak into the like button's house and line the floor next to their bed with Lego pieces, and then set off their fire alarm. Also, please subscribe to this channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's stories. In New Mexico, there is a very deep body of water called the Blue Hole that formed after this huge sinkhole filled with water. And because the visibility inside of the Blue Hole is so good, it's become a very popular swimming and underwater diving site. But at the bottom of the Blue Hole, 84 feet down, there is this little tiny opening that almost looks like the drain at the bottom of your bathtub, except it's just big enough that a grown person with scuba tanks on could wriggle through it. And if they did, they'd be entering into a vast network of tunnels and caves that have never been mapped, and many of them have never been explored. In 1976, 2 recreational divers from Oklahoma and were exploring that deep section of the Blue Hole when they got lost and drowned. When the police went in, they started to get lost themselves, and when they finally located the bodies and brought them up again, they told the owners of the land that the Blue Hole was on that that section of the cave is incredibly dangerous, and until you get someone in here to professionally map it out, you really should not be letting anyone go down there. And so the owners decided, you know what, instead of mapping this out, let's just seal it off permanently. And so they put this huge metal grate over it and bolted that down, and then they put a whole bunch of boulders over that sealed up metal grate. Fast forward to 2016, and an elite diving organization called the ADM Exploration Foundation that literally goes around the world exploring unmapped caves and professionally maps them, they reached out to the owners of the Blue Hole Cave and said, hey, we'd be happy to map out your forbidden section. and the owners granted them permission. So this would be the first time in 40 years that anyone had been in the deepest section of the blue hole. One of the divers that was going to be on this excursion was a guy named Shane Thompson. He had been a diving instructor for the United States Navy before becoming an advanced scuba instructor in San Diego. All in, he had about 20 years of diving experience, most of it the cave diving variety. On March 26th, 2016, the boulders were removed and the grate was unbolted, and the entrance to the forbidden section of the blue hole was now open. Shane had actually been told to stay on land as a safety standby diver, while another diver named Mike Young was going to be the first into the cave and would just explore the upper section. But as soon as Mike Young got in the water that morning, a couple minutes later, Shane was in the water after him, and Mike remembers as he was making his way down the main cavern section before getting to the actual forbidden entrance, looking up and seeing Shane coming towards him and thinking, I thought he was supposed to stay on land, but he figured someone must have told him to go in, and so he didn't think much about it. And so Shane and Mike continue down to the entrance. Shane would be the first one to wriggle his way through this very claustrophobia-inducing entrance. Once he was through, Mike followed after him, and at this point, it's pitch black. I mean, there's a little bit of light up in the main cavern, but once you're down below in the forbidden section, you can't see anything. So they both got their high-powered flashlights out, and immediately as they're kicking it out down the tunnel, they realize there's a lot of silt inside of this section. I mean, no one's been down here in 40 years, so everything is just kind of settled, and so their lights aren't really that good. It would be like driving in really intense fog and turning on your high beams. That's not going to do anything. You're just going to illuminate the fog around you. But they were kind of expecting this, so they just slowly made their way forward before Shane identified a tunnel that kind of branched off to the right, and so Shane is pointing his light down this tunnel. Mike sees Shane pointing it, so he goes up and he looks too, and they can see there is an opening at the end of this tunnel, maybe 20-30 feet down, that appears to open up into a much larger cavern. But what they were not able to see from their position, or perhaps just in haste they didn't realize this, is the tunnel actually starts big and then funnels down to almost a point. And in order to get into that larger cavern at the end of the tunnel, you basically need to force yourself through that hole. It is not an easy space to fit through. But either way, Shane takes off first, Mike follows him, and as they're moving down this tunnel, the silt is getting kicked up very dramatically all around them. And so now they cannot tell that the walls are basically closing in on them. And as they're getting closer and closer to what they think is going to be this huge cavern, they actually suddenly get stuck. Shane gets stuck first, Mike comes up alongside him because it's so silty he can't see, and he swims right between Shane's leg and the wall and gets wedged. Mike stays calm and begins to push himself backwards to just retreat out of the situation he is in. He can't see anything, but he can tell what he needs to do. Shane, meanwhile, who's basically right in front of him, he starts kicking like a madman. In fact, his fins are hitting Mike in the head, and all the silt is getting kicked up, and so Mike just continues to push himself back all the way back about 10 or 15 feet, while Shane, in a total panic, instead of coming backwards towards Mike, begins going forward through this tiny little narrow opening and somehow manages to force himself into this chamber. Mike has retreated back out to the main hallway, and he's just waiting for Shane to do the same thing. But when he never shows up, Mike goes back down the tunnel, he goes right up to the little entrance into this cavern, and he pokes his head in and he scans the light around, and he doesn't see Shane anywhere, but he sees right away that there's all these different exits into different tunnels that shoot all over this cavern. And remember, this is a totally unexplored section, and so there's no way for him to know where any of these go. But he knows Shane had to have gone this way. It's only been a few moments. He's got to be in here somewhere. And so he takes a deep breath, and he begins forcing himself through this tiny little hole, which took him quite a while, because Shane, when he went through, it was adrenaline and panic that pushed him through, which is probably why he did it so quickly. Mike really struggled to get through it. But once he was through, he pointed his light up and he looked for the biggest opening to one of those tunnels, and he began swimming up after Shane. And after a very long and windy and at times incredibly narrow, where Mike is second guessing himself why he's even doing this, he manages to get to the end, and it's a dead end, and curled up at the very back of the dead end was Shane. His mouthpiece was out and he was deceased. Mike was unable to recover him this day. He had to go all the way back out, force himself back through that hole, and go up to the surface and get some other people involved before they could come back and recover his body. So the running theory is that when Shane panicked and began swimming through that tight little space into that chamber, he must have somehow believed that he had gotten turned around and was making his way towards the exit. Now, it's easy for us to say, dude, you're in a tight little tunnel and you couldn't even get out. How could you have possibly turned around? But in reality, when you're stuck hundreds of feet underground in a tunnel that is unexplored, silt's been kicked up all around you, someone's blocking your way behind you, there's something blocking your way ahead, and you're pinched all around on your side by rocks. The mind can do some pretty crazy and delusional things. And once he pushed through that hole using adrenaline to force himself through, he went up thinking, I'm gonna get out, I'm gonna get out. Except he went into a dead end. And by the time he reached the end, either his mouthpiece was knocked out or he passed out and he dropped the mouthpiece out of his mouth. But either way, it shows you what can happen when you are trapped underwater and you panic. After Shane's body was recovered, they resealed the forbidden section, and to this day, no one is allowed to go in again. Indian Springs is a very popular underwater diving location in Florida. Deep below the surface, there are hundreds and hundreds of miles of tunnels that are both explored and unexplored. The majority of the unexplored tunnels are down at the 300-foot mark, which is significantly deeper than the average recreational diver goes. In fact, below 120 feet, you need specialized equipment and training, and very few people have that. In November of 1991, a specially trained, specially qualified group of elite divers went to Indian Springs to conduct a research dive down at the 300-foot mark. They were basically looking for unexplored passageways that they could explore and map out. There was a number of divers that were going to be a part of this dive, but the only two that were going to be passing through something called SCARIEST restriction were Parker Turner and Bill Gavin. SCARIEST restriction is this very narrow section of Indian Springs that's located down at the 120-foot mark. If you think of Indian Springs like an hourglass, you have a big open space up top, you get a big open space down below, and SCARIEST restriction is that tiny little space in the center of the hourglass. Before they began this dive, they threw a line down through SCARIEST restriction all the way down to the 300-foot mark that had an anchor at the end of it, and this would serve as their guideline so that when they were going down deep, if silt kicked up or visibility was obstructed for any reason, they always had a way to reference where they needed to go, up or down. On the morning of November 17th, Bill and Parker put on their dive gear, they fired up their underwater scooters they were using, and they began their descent. They made it down to SCARIEST restriction, and one by one, they would lead with their scooter, and their body would follow along past, and each of them were able to get through without any issue. Once on the other side, they took note that on the wall next to them, and this will matter later on, they noticed a sign that had been placed there. It was a very distinctive up and down arrow to show upstream and downstream flows. And so they took mental note that there was this distinctive arrow sign right at the bottom of SCARIEST restriction, and they continued down. They stopped at 140 feet and they kind of looked around for a couple of minutes before continuing all the way down to 300 feet, which is where they were intending to go. And they explored for about 25 minutes before looking at their watches and saying, yep, we got to go back up. So with one hand on their scooters and one hand on the guideline, they begin making their ascent. And as they're getting closer and closer to SCARIEST restriction, they start noticing these huge clouds of silt just in the middle of the water all around them. And they didn't cause this. They were not in an area where it was so tight they were kicking up silt. And it had been quite a while before they had come down through SCARIEST restriction, so this really couldn't be the silt that they had kicked up when they had first come into the cave. And so they looked at each other and thought, that's a little bit weird. I wonder what's going on above us. But they both kind of shrugged and thought, it can't be that big of a deal. And again, holding on to that guideline, they keep on going up, up, up until their hands stop because the guideline is now leading them into sand and rock and mud, as if the guideline is going into the wall. And they're looking at what they're holding on to and it doesn't make any sense. And without communicating at all, they both are thinking, okay, let's go back down and make sure we're in the right place because it seems like we hit a dead end here. And so they turn around, and as they're going down the guideline now, again, there's no other lines down here. There isn't another way to get mixed up, but it's human instinct to think, let me just retrace my footsteps here. As they're going down, they see on their left the distinctive up and down arrow that they saw when they came in. And that's when they stopped and looked at each other and they realized SCARIEST restriction has caved in. We're trapped. Each of the men had a slate where they could use a grease pen to write a message and hold it up and show their dive partner, and that was how they communicated. And at this point, Parker wrote, "What are we going to do now?" And Bill wrote back, let's look around. And so they turn around and they follow the guideline back up to the cave-in, and they start trying to clear the debris away, but they're finding it almost impossible because as soon as they move something out of the way, whatever is on top just pushes down into it and fills it back in. After a couple of minutes of doing that and all the silt is in their faces, they couldn't even hold their slates up to talk to each other because the visibility was so bad. So they both went lower in the water column to where there was no silt around them, and they both looked at each other, and that's when Parker held up his air gauge and showed Bill, I only have about 10 minutes of air left. And that's when Bill looked at his air gauge and he realized he too only had about 10 minutes of air left. Parker scribbles something on his slate and he holds it up to Bill, and it just says, "What are we gonna do now?" And Bill, not knowing what else to say, just wrote, "Hold on, I'll take a look." And so Bill leaves the guideline and swims over to another section away from Squaw's restriction in hopes he might find some other exit out of the space they're in, even though he knew full well there wasn't anything besides Squaw's restriction. And after a couple of minutes of looking around and not finding an additional exit, he goes back over to where Parker had been when he had left him, except Parker's not here anymore. And Bill suddenly thinks maybe he's found a way to get through this. And so Bill, with almost no air left, grabs the guideline and swims up into the silty cloud and gets to the cave-in to discover it's still caved in. However, he sees the base of Parker's tanks wedged in the obstruction itself. And he's looking at the tanks thinking, how did Parker get in that position? And then he realizes that's just his tanks. Parker is not attached to them anymore. And that's when Bill realizes what Parker probably had done. Parker had tried to force himself through the obstruction and probably got about halfway before becoming completely wedged and stuck himself. And he had to make the terrifying decision to take one more good breath and then ditch your air tanks and try to swim on a breath hold to the set of spare tanks they had set up about 100 meters away above Squaw's restriction. But at this point, regardless what's happened with Parker, his tanks were positioned in a way that it had created a little bit of an opening in the obstruction that Bill was able to swim through with his tanks on. Now he has almost no air left, and so once he got through, he realized he had about 30 seconds of air, and he swam as fast as he could to these spare tanks, hoping to see Parker on them, breathing and alive. But unfortunately, right as they came into view, Parker wasn't anywhere to be seen. Bill swims as fast as he can. He actually literally runs out of air and is on a breath hold himself by the time he reaches these tanks. He takes a huge gulp of air, and after he calmed down, he took his light out and he scanned around and he found Parker, and he was floating, deceased clearly, about 30 meters away. He had made it pretty far on a breath hold, but had just gone slightly off, and he didn't have any of his equipment. It was all attached to his tanks. And so in total darkness, he was just blindly swimming and did not locate the air tanks. And you can only imagine what his final few seconds were like. Before all of this happened, when Parker and Bill were down at 300 feet, some of the limestone broke off from the ceiling, landed in such a way that it caused this huge underwater mudslide, and it all funneled down, completely blocking up Squaw's restriction. For any diver who can stomach the risks, Bushman's Hole is a world-class diving spot. It's located on a privately owned game farm in South Africa. In the middle of the farm's 11,000 acres sits this massive crater in the ground that from rim to rim is hundreds of feet wide. If you hike down the crater to the middle, there's this little tiny basin of water that almost looks like an oversized puddle. This is the entrance to Bushman's Hole. Once you step into this little puddle and push your way through the very claustrophobia-inducing entrance, you open up into the biggest freshwater cave in the world that goes down to nearly 900 feet. For the people that have been in there, they say it's unbelievable and it's like spacewalking. For young South African Dion Dreyer, the pull to go to Bushman and explore it was irresistible. Dion had always been a bit of an adrenaline junkie. By the time he was 17, he was racing cars and building motorcycles, and by the time he was 20, he had picked up a new activity, cave diving. Dion had logged about 200 dives before he was invited by a diving group to go to Bushman's Hole and explore it on Christmas break 1994. They were planning a descent to 492 feet, so about the halfway point of the cave, and they needed one more diver, and so Dion was thrilled to go. The dive was going great, but on the way up, as they were making their ascent, the diver ahead of Dion looked back at him, and Dion seemed fine. He gave the hand signal that everything was going great. He had his flashlight out. And then about 30 feet higher in the water, that same diver turned around to check on Dion, and Dion wasn't there anymore. And in fact, this guy saw his flashlight that was still attached to him basically wavering as it sunk farther and farther down Bushman's hole. This diver immediately stops the group above him, and he turns around and starts swimming as fast as he can down to try to get to Dion. But Dion was sinking so quickly that this diver realized that it's a suicide mission if I try to go down there. I will either pass out or run out of air. And so deeply saddened, this group of divers had to turn around and leave Dion at the bottom of Bushman's hole. Although the other divers didn't know for sure, they told Dion's parents that most likely he had suffered from a deep water blackout and then had drowned. When authorities were notified about what happened to Dion, they sent a robot down to the bottom of Bushman's hole to just locate his body before they sent a person down there. But they never could find his body. They could only ever find his helmet. Dion's parents are devastated. They're never going to see their son again. And since they don't have a body to bury, they decide to go down to Bushman's hole and put a plaque up next to the entrance to commemorate their son. 10 years later, Dave Shaw, who was a 50-year-old extremely audacious cave diver, was passing the 800-foot mark inside of Bushman's hole, becoming the third person ever to reach this depth. Shaw touched down on the sloping bottom of the cave. He detached from the cave reel, took out his flashlight, and began swimming around the bottom. As he was scanning around, he looked about 50 feet to his left, and he saw something he immediately recognized. It was a human body. They were on their back with their arms stretched out towards the surface, and when Shaw went over to them, he immediately recognized that this is Dion Dreyer. Ever since Dion died inside of Bushman and had never been recovered, any diver that went in there was keeping their eye out in case they saw him. Shaw examines Dion to see if he's going to be able to be pulled to the surface, if he's solid enough to be pulled to the surface, and he can tell that his hands have skeletonized as well as his skull, although his mask is still placed directly on his skull. But his wetsuit and his tanks had kind of kept the rest of his body pretty tight, which gave him some mass, which meant he'd be able to move him. But as soon as Shaw tried to move him, he couldn't get him to budge because his tanks were caught on something. And so Shaw stayed there for a minute trying to get him free, but he couldn't do it. And that's when Shaw started to think, okay, this is getting irresponsible. I'm gonna die down here too if I don't start making my ascent soon. So he ended up tying a line to Dion's body so he could be located again, and then Shaw began the very slow ascent back to the surface. On the way back up, Shaw felt an extreme sense of connection with Dion. He really felt bad for this kid, and all he wanted to do was get him back on land to give back to his family, to give them some closure. And so when he got on the surface, he immediately contacted authorities and said, I'm gonna go back down and I'm gonna get him. And Shaw also called Dion's parents and told them, I am gonna retrieve your son. And his parents were apparently overjoyed. They couldn't believe they were going to get to see their son again. After lots and lots of planning, Shaw's recovery of Dion was scheduled for January 8th, 2005. The dive was going to take 12 hours, and it wasn't just going to be Dave doing the retrieval. It was going to be like a relay race. Dave would be the first one down, and a couple minutes after he entered the water, another diver would go in who would stop about 100 feet above Dave, and then a third diver would go in and stop 100 feet above the second diver, and so on and so forth. Dave would put the body bag over Dion and then carry his body up to the first guy, who would turn around, bring the body up to the next guy, and the next guy to the next guy until Dion was out of the water. At 6:13 in the morning, Shaw entered the water with a camera on his helmet to film the operation. Shortly after he submerged, Dion's parents walked down to the edge of the water to watch. They showed up intentionally late so as not to put added pressure on Shaw. Shaw dropped very quickly to the bottom of Bushman's hole. He actually arrived about a minute and a half faster than he expected to. As soon as he got down, he shined his light and he found Dion's body. He went over to him, he got the body bag out, and he got to work. 13 minutes after Shaw had submerged, the diver who was slotted above him, that would be the first to receive Dion's body, began looking for signs that Shaw was done and was moving up towards him. But when he looked down, he saw Shaw's flashlight wasn't moving. This diver continued to watch the flashlight very intently to make sure his eyes weren't playing tricks on him. And after a couple of minutes and still no movement, this diver begins going deeper and deeper to try to get a better look at Shaw to see what's going on. And when he got a little bit closer, it became very clear that Shaw was not moving. This diver immediately goes into rescue mode and starts going straight down to get to Shaw to try to help him if he still can. And as he's moving down, he hears this fizzling sound and he looks at his wrist and he can tell that one of his gauges has broken. And this gauge was vital to the dive, and it meant he would not be able to get down there. And so with a heavy heart, he had to turn around and go back up. And because of the depth at which they were diving, he could not just go right to the surface and tell everybody what had happened. He needed to stop at various decompression stops along the way. But he had a slate, and on it he wrote in his grease pen, "Dave's not coming back." And he swam the slate up to the next diver who would have received Dion's body, but instead receives this slate. He takes the slate up to the next diver, to the next diver, to the next diver, all the way up to the surface. As soon as this message was read out loud to the group standing around Bushman's Hole, which included Dion's parents, there was 30 seconds of stunned silence. No one could believe this was happening. And then after the silence, Dion's parents are beside themselves. Not only are they not going to see their son probably ever again, but they feel like they are somehow responsible for Shaw's death. Eventually, by the end of the night, all of the other divers that were in the water that day successfully exited the cave and were just fine. As for Shaw, much like Dion, there really wasn't a good way to get him out, and so everyone came to terms with the reality that he was going to be down there with Dion probably forever. The news was so devastating that the team decided to leave all their equipment in place. Eventually, they did need to go down and collect their gear, so everybody goes down to the edge of Bushman's Hole, and before they begin retrieving all of the lines, they sang Amazing Grace in memoriam for the lost diver. Afterwards, they started pulling up the lines, and as they're doing that, they noticed all these bubbles coming up from the bottom of the cave. And they looked a little bit closer, and it was Shaw's body and Dion's body. Basically, Shaw had been attached to this line, and he had managed to free Dion before he had passed. And so when they pulled the line, both of them were freed, and they floated to the surface. And so even though Shaw would die doing it, he was able to get Dion out of Bushman's cave for his family. After the two bodies were taken out, they noticed that the camera on Dave's head was still intact, and it had filmed everything all the way through his final moments. And so they took the tape out and they watched it forward and backwards, slow-mo, frame by frame, and they analyzed it to the point where they understood what happened. When Shaw gets down to Dion, Dion's body that had previously been stuck, and that was the reason Shaw had not been able to free him the first time, somehow he's become unfree and he's now free-floating. And Shaw is having a really hard time trying to control this free-floating body, and his body is literally breaking apart in front of him. As Shaw is trying to wrangle his body, you can hear him start grunting, his breathing is getting elevated, and he's totally losing control of the situation, and the bottom of this cave is slanted, and it's all silty and muddy, and so in the camera you see all this mud and silt getting kicked around, and the visibility is very poor, and after it clears, you see Shaw has gotten completely tangled in some line that's also tangled on Dion. So basically, Dion has become his anchor. At this point, Shaw shifts his focus to try to get the lines off of himself, and you can hear his breathing now is becoming much more desperate. It almost sounds like he's gulping for air, and probably at this point, although we don't know for sure, he's suffering from narcosis, which is a condition that divers will run into where it's like you've drank a whole bunch of alcohol on an empty stomach. It's like you're totally drunk and you're confused, and it's clear that he's becoming a little bit disoriented. And instead of going away from Dion's body to try to go back up and save yourself, instead he turns and starts fumbling with Dion's midsection, and then he gets out a pair of scissors, but he doesn't use them, he just holds them. Finally, he turns away from Dion because it's clear you're not going to be able to get him out at this point, and with the scissors in hand that he never used, because again, he's probably suffering from narcosis and he's confused, he starts beginning to make his way over to the area where you can go back up, but he starts slowing down, his breathing becomes tragically desperate, and then it becomes silent, and then there's no more movement, and Dave Shaw is dead. 10 days after the bodies were recovered from Bushman's Hole, Dion's parents, although they are absolutely devastated about what happened to Shaw, and they feel very guilty, but at the same time, they're so excited because they get to go to the morgue and see their son again for the first time in 10 years. They don't care what state his body's in. Just the fact that he's actually here, that their actual son is going to be in front of them, was just overwhelming for them. And when they went in, they were really fixated on the fact that he had underwear on that they both recognized. Apparently they had bought him a set of jockey underwear and he was wearing jockey underwear. As strange as it is, it was like they got to bond with their child one more time. So that's going to do it, guys. Let me know in the comments what you thought of these 3 stories, and I will pin the best comment at the top of the comments section. If you enjoyed today's stories and you haven't done this already, please sneak into the like button's house and line the floor next to their bed with Lego pieces and then set off their fire alarm. Also, please subscribe to this channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username is the same for both platforms. It's JohnBallen416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is MrBallen. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called Mr. Ballen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya.